by the 1990s, that was quite a bit of time after our next guest, Ralph Dumain, read the novel, not in Hungarian, but as a teenager in Esperanto in Buffalo, New York. And so let me tell you a bit about Ralph, who will give a brief introduction. Ralph Dumain is an American librarian and independent researcher. He now lives in Washington, D.C. In 1991, he became librarian and archivist of the CLR James Institute in New York. Dumain's unusual website, the Autodidact Project, autodidactproject.org, publishes original biographies, research guides, and writings by Dumain himself, as well as a wide range of writings by others, famous, obscure, forgotten, providing study material and perspectives that might not otherwise be available, that might not otherwise come to the attention of both formally and self-educated readers. Dumain began to teach himself Esperanto as a high school student. A year and a half later, he translated one of Submari's novellas, Vincenzo, into English. In 1987, Dumain co-founded the World Atheist Esperanto Association. He has published his writings and translations in both Esperanto and English. And he has lectured and been interviewed both on CLR James and on the social history of Esperanto. So I'll pass the microphone.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Indeed, as a teenager, I read Sakari's most important works in Esperanto in 1969 and 1970. I read Kazohinia while working as a volunteer in a summer camp in 1970. I always had to bring books wherever I went. So I'm very pleased to be able to be invited to revisit Kazohinia 42 years later. And also, perhaps even more so, because next month will mark the 125th anniversary of the launch of Esperanto. So, fortunately, Paul and this documentary have covered a certain amount of ground, so I don't have to do that. But I will add a few facts about Sakari's life and his work as he himself reports it. Now, Sakari says that as a child, he moved around, he moved about quite a bit because of his father's occupation. Some of the places he settled in later became parts of Czechoslovakia and Romania. He was exposed to national antagonisms, which he found senseless. He began learning Esperanto at the age of 14. We learned, of course, that he studied mechanical engineering starting in 1950 and became an engineer. Now, World War I and the economic crisis that followed a decade later, and the first rumblings of the Second World War in the making, consolidated Sakari's unmitigatedly pessimistic vision. Another thing we should know about him is that the Esperanto movement was very dear to him. It embodied his separation from nationalistic and parochial concerns and provided a literary escape route out of an oppressive political environment, which actually has happened for many Eastern Europeans over the decades. Sakari also saw Esperanto as a fitting vehicle for cultural exchange, especially for literatures that would otherwise be nationally isolated. In a tribute to the beloved Hungarian Esperanto poet Emil Bagi in 1966, Sakari, while vigorously reaffirming his lifelong pessimism, conceded that without romantic hopefulness, such as Bagi's, nothing in the world could ever be accomplished, and Esperanto was the home of the hopeful. So that's about as much hope as Sakari was willing to concede. Now, a little bit about his work. And again, as he himself reports it, Sakari's major influences were Jonathan Swift, Imre Madac, author of the classic The Tragedy of Man, published in 1861, and Sakari's contemporary Pricis Carinti. In 1931, Sakari began writing a trilogy titled In Vain, taking place in the past, present, and future, with the same characters, the same social types, and the same tragic fates recurring in each time period. Dissatisfied with this trilogy, he never published it. However, it was published finally posthumously in Hungarian in 1935, he began his masterwork Voyage to Kazohinia. Now, Sainte-Marie himself claimed that Esperanto was the original, but people who have studied the text, Esperanto, say that that's unlikely, that Hungarian is obviously the original. He translated himself into Esperanto. We also learned something about its dicey publishing history. The Esperanto version couldn't be published in the 1930s because of the political climate. Sainte-Marie claims that the 1941 edition was heavily censored. That's what he says. There were subsequent Hungarian editions in 1946 and 1957, again punctuating periods of political repression. The Esperanto edition was published in 1958, and of course you've heard about the Hungarian press, the English language published in Hungary in 1975. Now, in addition to Kazohinia, Sainte-Marie was the author, of course, of utopian and dystopian fiction. This novel incorporates both, actually. Futuristic and science fiction, philosophical and social satire. The major themes of his shorter fiction are the mysteries of domination and submission, irrationality, and his favorite theme of the ultimate implications of technology. His novella Machine Mondo, which means machine world, published in Esperanto in 1964, takes the logic implicit in Kazohinia to its ultimate conclusion. Sainte-Marie maintained his philosophical position for the balance of his life. In an interview in 1973, a year before his death, he stated that Kazohinia is even more relevant now than it was in the 1930s. His thesis, reiterated over decades, is that technological society enables abundance and requires cooperation, whereas all human society is based on scarcity and aggression. This instinct was once functional, but is now obsolete and dangerous. And this aggressive impulse is the basis of all amusement, all art, all culture. Human instinct, which prevails in all social regimes, cannot be modified. At best, it can only be contained. Man must learn to adapt himself to the machine. In a 1972 essay on Voyage, Sainte-Marie restated his thesis most forcefully. He argued that Voyage's perspective, misrepresented by others for political reasons, is unequivocally pessimistic, and that Sainte-Marie's own work is a logical continuation of Voyage's. Every stage of social organization, including socialism, is driven by man's innate propensity for aggression. Sainte-Marie denies that history is driven by material causes and motives, and insists that salvation could only be attained by a biological mutation. Now, this is how Sainte-Marie describes his own work. The criticism and the reviews, the analyses I read have all been in Esperanto, and of course, not all of the critics agree with Sainte-Marie's own statement of his own philosophy. Perhaps we'll get into that later. But in any case, it's time for us to move on to the next part of our program, and I thank you very much.